It was a quiet night, the kind where the air hangs heavy and the silence amplifies every little sound. Mark was walking home after his late shift at the diner. The streets were deserted, lit only by the occasional flickering street lamp. The rhythmic tapping of his shoes on the pavement was the only thing keeping him company. He preferred walking home, even at this hour. It gave him time to think, to breathe. He turned onto Maple Street, a shortcut that cut through a neighborhood of abandoned houses. Most people avoided this area, claiming it felt wrong. Mark didn't believe in superstitions. To him, it was just a faster route. As he walked, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing under one of the dim streetlights, not moving, just watching. Mark's pace slowed. The figure was a man, tall and thin, wearing a suit that seemed too large for his lanky frame. But what unsettled Mark most was the man's face. He had the widest grin Mark had ever seen, stretched unnaturally from ear to ear. The man wasn't doing anything, just standing there, smiling. Mark tried to shake off the unease. It was probably some drunk guy or a prankster trying to scare people. He kept walking, deliberately not looking back. But as he turned the next corner, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There he was again, the smiling man, standing under another streetlight, closer this time. Mark's heart began to race. How had he gotten ahead of him? There were no sounds of footsteps, no signs of movement. He picked up his pace, his mind racing for a logical explanation. The man couldn't be following him. It was impossible. Yet with every turn Mark took, the smiling man was there, always under the streetlight, always grinning. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing in the empty street. "What do you want?" The smiling man didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, as if amused by Mark's outburst. Mark's skin prickled. He decided he'd had enough. Pulling out his phone, he tried to call the police, but the screen stayed blank. Dead. He cursed under his breath and shoved it back in his pocket. Mark's pace quickened into a jog. He needed to get out of here, to get home. But no matter how fast he moved, the smiling man was always there, under the next streetlight, grinning. Mark's jog turned into a full sprint, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't care if he looked crazy. He needed to escape. He cut through an alley, hoping to lose him. The narrow path was dark, the air thick with the smell of garbage and damp concrete. Mark's footfalls echoed in the confined space, and for a moment, he felt relief. There was no sign of the smiling man. He slowed his pace, leaning against a wall to catch his breath. "Why are you running?" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it came from right behind him. Mark's blood turned to ice. He spun around, but the alley was empty. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then he saw it. At the end of the alley, the smiling man stepped into view, his grin impossibly wide. But this time he wasn't standing still. He was walking. No, gliding toward Mark, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a puppet on strings. Mark's legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kicked in, and he bolted out of the alley, back onto the main street. He didn't dare look back. His apartment building was just a few blocks away. If he could make it there, he'd be safe. He reached his building, fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He glanced over his shoulder. The street was empty, no sign of the smiling man. Mark let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him as he pushed open the door and slammed it shut behind him. Upstairs in his apartment, Mark locked every window and door. He sat on his couch, trying to calm his racing heart. He told himself it was over, that he was safe. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Mark tried to convince himself that he was safe. The smiling man had been following him, yes, but he was home now, and there was no reason for the man to be here. Right? The silence of the apartment pressed in on him. There were no sounds of the smiling man's footsteps, no echoes of his unsettling grin. For a moment, Mark thought maybe it was all just his imagination. Maybe he had been too tired after a long shift. But then he froze. There it was again. A sound. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. A tap, tap, tap. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was coming from outside. Slowly, cautiously, he walked to the window. The blinds were still drawn, but he hesitated before pulling them open. He had to know. He peered through the small crack, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes darted around. The street was empty, no one in sight. He shook his head. It's just the wind, he told himself. But then a figure caught his attention, under the street lamp, far down the road. There was the smiling man, standing still as if waiting. Mark's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen him walk past, hadn't heard his footsteps. He had just appeared again, and he was smiling, always smiling. Mark's first instinct was to run, but he stayed rooted to the spot, his body paralyzed with fear. He didn't understand. He should have been safe in his apartment. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. Mark could feel the man's gaze, even from this distance. It was as though the man was looking directly at him, right through the walls, right through the blinds. Then suddenly, the man raised one hand. It was slow, deliberate, almost a wave. But instead of a friendly gesture, it felt like an invitation, like a silent beckoning. Mark's body trembled. He couldn't stay here. He needed to get out. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the smiling man was gone. He vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the lingering feeling of being watched. Mark stood frozen at the window, staring at the empty street. It was silent again, eerily so. His mind raced, his body still locked in place, trying to make sense of the impossible. It was as if the smiling man had never been there at all, except for the unsettling feeling that now settled deep in Mark's gut. Finally, his legs gave out, and he sank down onto the floor, leaning against the wall. His thoughts kept repeating one question over and over. Who was he?